Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Here's Michael Schindhelm speaking, the mentor to the massive open online course on the Contemporary Chinese Art Award initiated by Uli Sigg, an effort which had been put in place by the Zurich University for the Arts. You have enrolled for this course for maybe quite some time. We are running it already for a while. Before I start our webinar today, I would like to tell you that we run this course still for a few more weeks. So whenever you want to learn more, then you have already learned about the Contemporary Chinese Art Award and its history and current status, and maybe also future plans. Then you're welcome to join this course more intensely. There are 6 chapters on that subject. I would like to quickly mention again, in the first chapter we speak about Chinese contemporary art in the context of the cultural globalization during the last 20 years or so. In the chapter 2, we're introducing the collector Uli Sigg and his history with the award. In the third chapter, we discuss how China itself became aware of contemporary Chinese art, embraced contemporary Chinese art, and one generation after the other of contemporary Chinese artists were born. One of the major elements of the next chapter is the subject of how the award itself had been designed. What are the objectives of the award, and what is the award for? In the chapter 5, we are speaking about the history of the CCAA from its humble beginnings in the 90s to becoming a very powerful tool to making artists known, even famous, and very successful. And in the final chapter, we speak about the current status of the award and the plans for the future. This is, in brief, what this course is all about. We are recording this webinar today, as we did also earlier sessions of that kind. What I would like to introduce to you is this possibility of also asking questions directly to me, verbally, acoustically. There's a possibility to go online, to go on audio mode, and to sort of get in touch with me directly, talk to me. If you don't know how to do this, or if it doesn't work out for whatever reason, you can either just on the chat pan leave a message so that our organizer is helping you, or otherwise, maybe more straightforward, just put your comments or questions in the section questions on your GoToWebinar board. I will read them and try to answer them. So in other words, I hope that there will be some interaction between all of us. I would like to start, however, with a short input to maybe also refresh your memory on the subject, or if you haven't heard much about it yet, to get introduced to it. So what I would like to do now is to share with you my screen, and by doing so, to run a short PowerPoint presentation where I'm quickly explaining to you what is so interesting about the CCAA and why we have created this open online course. So I hope that you're going to see my screen very soon, or maybe already. What I would like to start with is to introduce to you quickly the history or the biography of Mr. Uli Sigg, the Swiss art collector who created the award. Before he became an art collector, he in fact, in the first place, was a manager to a multinational company called Schindler, being based in Switzerland. You may have seen the icon of that, the brand already, because very often tools being created by Schindler have probably transported you from one place to another vertically or horizontally, because Schindler is mostly creating elevators and escalators. This is what they're famous for. In the late 70s, Red China had this interesting idea of creating an incubator, or you could say an experiment, an economic experiment, to find out if market economy would be a better approach to developing the economy than planned economy during the communist rule. And so after Mao's death, the Chinese reached out to several companies in the world, among them also Schindler, to ask them if they would be interested in creating a joint venture between their company in the West and the government in China. Finally, the Chinese decided to do the first joint venture with the Swiss company Schindler, and made or asked for Mr. Sigg becoming sorry, I have a technical problem here quickly to resolve. Asked Mr. Sigg to become the vice president of that company. I'm not sure if I can always run this as a PowerPoint presentation, because so far I can see. Oh, no, it's working. I'm sorry for this glitch. You see here Mr. Sigg in 1980, probably, among his colleagues from Switzerland, but also from China, how he's creating this first joint venture. You see him here also later, because at some point he later became the ambassador of Switzerland to Beijing, to China, and he's meeting here at that time president of the country, Jiang Zemin, who was already an acquaintance of Mr. Sigg, because when Mr. Sigg arrived as one of the first white people and businessmen in China to create the first joint venture, Jiang Zemin was responsible for foreign investments, and they actually stroked the deal together at that time. Mr. Sigg later became quite a successful investor, and for that reason was able to purchase this real estate in Switzerland, where he stores a major part of his collection. The collection itself is stored otherwise, because he has a collection of more than 2,000 pieces, and in his house he is usually just showing around 200 of them. It's not public, by the way. There is a storage next to the house with the rest of his collection. Mr. Sigg was trying, as ambassador 25 years or so back in China, to reach out to the, at that time, totally opaque and unknown scene of contemporary Chinese art. And he met artists, maybe as one of the first Westerners ever, in their, at that time, humble studios or apartments. Usually exhibitions or shows would be shown only in private premises, sometimes only for a couple of hours, because that was all still illegal at that time. The artists, being now, of course, much older than at that time, were some of them already artists during the Mao time, some of them only later became artists. And you can see that they are now either in, like this gentleman here, who is a famous sculptor, Xiao Zhang Wen, based in Guangzhou. He created many sculptures already during the Mao time. Here you see actually him showing to his daughter a sculpture of Mao he did in 1948. He said that he never did later Mao anymore, because until 1948 Mao was rather a real revolutionary and innovative personality, and that's why he admired him and created this sculpture. Later, as the chairman of the party and the head of the government, he turned actually into something very negative, and that's why he stayed away from depicting Mao any further. Wang Guanyi is one of the earliest stars of the contemporary art scene with his pop art he created in China. Here you see a Taiwanese art curator, Victoria Lu, who is very influential for the contemporary art scene in China, in Greater China. This gentleman is probably known to all of you, Ai Weiwei, of the same generation like Wang Guanyi, around 60 years old now, or late 50s. He experienced Cultural Revolution in a particular harsh way because his father, Ai Qing, was one of the most closest intellectuals, closest to Mao, and punished during the Cultural Revolution to live with his family under very critical conditions in the outskirts of the steppes on the border to Siberia. Fang Lijun, another famous artist of that generation, who introduced the bald head to Chinese art in general, and himself was very intensely involved also in the Tiananmen Square manifestation, student riots in 1989. I mentioned already Cao Fei, the daughter of Xiao Zhang Wen, who is currently probably one of the most successful and known younger artists from China. She had a great review show last year at the MoMA, and before also in Germany and in other countries. Fang Manbo is considered one of the first video artists from China. Zheng Fanzhu, who is here shown with a portrait he created about Uli Sigg, is the most financially successful among all the contemporary Chinese artists. Some of his work had been auctioned in Hong Kong for more than $20 million per piece. So he, in the meantime, ranks really among the most successful artists in the world. That's about some of the artists being represented in the collection. Otherwise, Uli Sigg really, as the person who was able to purchase many of these artworks as the first ever who seemed to be interested in contemporary Chinese art, tried actually to not only follow his own taste, and that's actually something very important to remember, but rather to play the role of a curator of a public institution who tried to save these artworks from damage, destruction, or disappearance, because there was a total disregard of art in the late 90s yet in China, and he collected these artworks in order to store them, to preserve them, and later on, at some point, maybe even to return them to China when China is ready to put them on public display. This is one of these famous artworks of the transition between the Mao time, and you still see some elements of Mao propaganda, but at the same time expressivity, which goes already further into the modern time. And there are other artworks of the collection which are considered really important landmarks, like here Bloodline by Zhang Zhaogang, or also even the sculpture of the dead Mao, or Follow Me by an artist who is considered otherwise somebody who is approaching calligraphy in a new way. One of the probably early landmarks of contemporary art dealing with calligraphy was Gu Wenda's Love work. Red Mao is another interesting approach to calligraphy, at the same time reflecting on Mao's impact on Chinese language, and in particular also the alphabet. And the Family Tree by Zhang Wen is probably one of the most famous and popular examples of contemporary Chinese art over the last 20 years or so. All these artworks you have seen are part of the collection of Uli Sigg, who himself decided at some point to donate 2/3 of his collection, or 1,500 artworks, to Hong Kong, where on the mainland side here you see near Victoria Harbour 40 hectares square or space, which is now dedicated to a public effort of the government of Hong Kong to create a large cultural center, the West Kowloon Cultural District. M+, the museum, which is considered to become part of this cultural hub, will host the collection Uli Sigg has donated to these people. You see here the construction site and an image of what it is supposed to become after completion. The design is made by the Swiss architects Herzog and Dömerong, who also designed for example, the Olympic Games Stadium in Beijing, or more importantly, maybe the Tate Modern in London, and also the extension to the Tate Modern in London. So in other words, this is what I wanted to share with you as an introduction to the subject, or maybe just kind of remembrance on what the CCAA is all about. What I have not mentioned here is that when Uli Sigg started collecting, he decided to make an important step, which was probably genius, and helped him a lot to make the research necessary. And I think this is very important to understand for us cultural workers today, because I think Uli Sigg was always considered as a collector, but he himself rather considered himself a researcher, somebody who tries to understand a foreign culture and even a foreign society through its art. And China in the late 90s was totally opaque. There were no magazines, there were no galleries, there were no curators, there was no writing, no publishing about art, etc. So even the artists themselves were disconnected from the society and from each other. So therefore, there was very little knowledge about what kind of art is available, what are artists doing in China, and where they're heading to. And that's why when Uli Sigg created during these years the Chinese Contemporary Art Award, it became immediately a very efficient tool to get to know artists and to get to know what they are doing, where they are living, under which circumstances, what they are thinking, what they are trying to achieve. So that's why the CCAA is to us an extraordinarily interesting tool for research. Not only on contemporary Chinese art, but it's probably very emblematic for how today international global players in the art scene are able to create tools which allow them to discover uncharted territories in the art world in emerging countries. The award is still there. In the meantime, already for 18 years or so. They have also premises in the outskirts of Beijing. There's management running this award. In the meantime, they have even a space where they host also events. All of this is probably pretty important for the Chinese contemporary art scene today in general. Okay, so far, and now I would like to allow you to ask some questions. So there's one first question. Did Sigg ever got in trouble with his different roles? On the one hand, as an ambassador with political duties and behaviors, and on the other hand, as an art collector with a different approach that might have not always fitted to an ambassador's work. No, this is indeed a very valid point. I think there could have been problems along the way, because Uli Sigg got in touch with artists who were at that time rather oppressed and certainly not regarded as representatives of the country or even the government. However, he was never really never really told to put his efforts on halt. He was able to collect his collection. He was able to mingle with artists, but he had, of course, to be careful at the same time. So he was, from the outset, a very diplomatic person who, on the one hand, tried also in a, let's say, intelligent way to introduce contemporary Chinese art to political decision makers. For example, by hanging contemporary Chinese art in the residence of the ambassador of Switzerland in Beijing, where many Chinese decision makers were invited to for dinners, for discussions, and other reasons. So he, this way, confronted these people also with their own contemporary Chinese contemporary art they were usually not aware of. And then I think Uli Sigg had such an enormously important role in the making of the new China's economy that the people had never forgot this and therefore appreciated very much his presence in China, and accepted also that he was becoming a collector of maybe sometimes not very much liked art. Even during the time when there was big trouble with people like Ai Weiwei, Uli Sigg was always able to still keep his connection to, on the one hand, the official China, and on the other hand, to supporting people like Ai Weiwei. There's another question. By looking at the history of Chinese contemporary art, the influence of Western modern art is obvious. Now the influence of China on the rest of the world is imminent. How do you see Chinese art influencing Western art now or in the near future? I totally agree with the fact that, in particular, in the first decade of the opening of China towards the outside world and the recognition of contemporary art in China, there was seriously and certainly a focus on art which was for Western eyes recognizable. So which means that the contemporary Chinese art in the beginning of the 90s and 2000s was resembling a lot on the Western art movements of the 20th century. You may know or heard of Ai Weiwei saying that he was very influenced by people like Duchamp or Andy Warhol and pop art in general. It's probably worth to mention that Ai Weiwei, for example, also lived 16 years of his life right after the end of the Cultural Revolution until the mid-90s in the US and in Manhattan, while Manhattan, or let's say better, the Greenwich Village, was still the powerhouse of contemporary art globally. So that's why he came across many of these movements and, of course, traced down also many of the historic remains of what happened in the art world in the decades before, in particular also in Greenwich Village or in the US. So that's why, of course, he was taught almost in an American way of looking at art, and I think he is not an exception. There were many artists of his generation who either in the West or even in China itself, or by traveling to Western countries, saw art and started, of course, their artwork by being influenced through Western art. In the meantime, there is a refocus. You feel that there is a kind of disappointment also in China over the limitations and repetitiveness of movements and creation in the Western world. So therefore, the Chinese more and more focus also on their own national identity. And there are like two different ways to deal with this. There's a number of artists who certainly follow rather global trends, and there are other artists who want to rather differentiate themselves from global trends and make a more national Chinese point, which is that they are, for example, working with particular Chinese subjects like calligraphy, ink art, or landscape art, which doesn't mean that they are traditional necessarily. They're just reinventing, restoring traditions in order to give them a contemporary expression. So in other words, there are these two different flows, or these two different types of movements. There's no doubt that the latter is particularly important for the recreation of the Chinese identity, and I think also for making clear to the world that there is something genuinely Chinese in the contemporary art scene, which cannot necessarily be copied or even anticipated in the Western world. With regards to the first movement, I would say that many of the artists who are following the global trends, of course, try also to be on top of the things. So they don't necessarily follow only anymore, but you can see that they add their very particular and different perspective on the functioning or the functionality, the importance, the relevance of contemporary art. You know still that China is on the one hand a country where art is immediately also a tool of politics or of social change, something the Western world is now re-embracing again, but in China was something always present. So that's why I think Chinese artists are generally rather prepared to seeing art also as a tool of communication, as a tool of critique, as a tool of social change. In this regard, I do think that Chinese contemporary art and Chinese contemporary artists will have also a growing influence on global mainstreams. Okay, any more questions? Yeah, okay. Somebody is asking the following question. You did a movie about Uli Sigg. You meant me. So I did a movie about Uli Sigg and other projects like this course. What fascinates you personally about Chinese contemporary art and Uli Sigg? All right. Indeed, I started developing a certain interest in China already rather early. I must say, I was myself born in East Germany, and I studied in the Soviet Union. I moved actually to the Soviet Union in 1979. This is the same year when Uli Sigg moved to China. And you could easily say that China and the Soviet Union at that time were probably the both most important countries under communist rule, with, again, very different approaches to the communist system and doctrine. That's why I was always interested in different social concepts and systems, and was interested, of course, also after the war in Germany fell, and I was able to live in a Western society and travel freely all over the world to, at the same time, keep an eye also on what is happening in that country which remained communist and certainly different from the Western world, China. So since the late 90s, I was traveling here and then to China, and I lived and worked at that time in Basel as the director of the theater in Basel. And as I mentioned earlier, Herzog and de Meuron, the architects, the Swiss architects with kind of, in the meantime, global success, at that time still less known in the world than today, were about to finish their work on the Tate Modern in London, which catapulted them into the global attention of investors and politicians who were supposed to create new spaces, museums, stadiums, etc. When Herzog and de Meuron, who became friends of mine during the 90s while I was working in Basel, told me that they are supposed to build the stadium or design the stadium for the Olympics in China, I felt that this is actually a great story, and we should immediately try to make a film out of this, because this is not only about architecture, but this is certainly about the change in China, because the Olympics will be used, and the stadium therefore too, as a platform to show the world how China looks at itself and sees itself and its role in the world. And I got to know Uli Sigg, who was kind of string puller behind the scene for making this deal between Herzog and de Meuron and China happening. And I got to know Ai Weiwei because he was at that time the go-between the Chinese government and the architects to facilitate the design work. And therefore, the film which came out of this with the title Bird's Nest, Herzog and de Meuron in China, was also a film about the transition and transformation of China, where Uli Sigg and Ai Weiwei were already instrumental characters. I do think that China is indeed an extraordinarily powerful country, but not only in terms of, say, economy and in terms of number of people or urbanization. I do think that China is really an extraordinary powerhouse for creativity. And over the last years, again and again, I have met at least two generations of younger Chinese people who, on the one hand, are very international and therefore knowledgeable about the world on the one hand, but still keep their Chinese identity. And that kind of mix enabled them also to develop a very particular Chinese creativity, which adds a lot to the global creativity. And that's why I think it's very important to study what's going on in China, because China is also, in terms of soft power, also in terms of culture and arts, certainly a very, very important emerging power. I would be interested in hearing about the current situation at the M+ Museum and the M+ Sigg Collection. So there were delays with the delivery of the museum. It was supposed to open already in 2017. This year, the so-called reunification of Hong Kong with mainland China and the end of the British rule in Hong Kong has its 20th anniversary. And the original plan was that this anniversary would be also celebrated or acknowledged with the opening of the M+ Museum. The reason for the delay is not exclusively due to, say, problems or delays within the development of the design and the construction or the decision-making within the administration in Hong Kong, but it had also to do majorly with a neighboring, even more important and larger construction site, the terminus of an express railway network which will connect the whole Pearl River Delta, including Hong Kong, within the next years. That train station had to come first, had to be built first, and there were huge delays for both political and technical reasons, and that's why there is also a delay, a consecutive delay with the delivery of M+. However, everybody is confident that by 2019 the museum will be ready. I know from Uli Sigg, whom I talked to just a few days ago, that there is a lot going on currently between the architects and the museum in detailed design, in already starting producing some elements, and also there is a lot of progress on the construction site itself. With regards to the collection, there's of course a major looming question always, and this is what would happen if the current freedom of expression Hong Kong still enjoys and enables Hong Kong also to put a collection on display with artworks from critical artists like Ai Weiwei. What would happen if one day, over time, this kind of leeway or freedom would disappear due to the influence of mainland China? And Uli Sigg was always aware of this possibility, and therefore had also claimed a clause or paragraph in his contract with Hong Kong that in case that the terms will not be fulfilled, which means that 5,000 square meters of the museum will constantly, permanently provided by the museum to put on display a part of the M+ Sigg collection. If, for example, that would be violated, or if some important artworks, because being critical, would be banned from the collection or from public display, Uli Sigg would be able to withdraw his collection. So in other words, there is a kind of lifeline. However, of course, we know that all these things would be very difficult and sad at the same time. So we can only hope that the process of democratization and the development of freedom of speech would be rather go ahead in mainland China to prevent any kind of obstructions in Hong Kong. So next question. Do you think that because modern art is still relatively new in China, art there is more free in the way that it is not as much burdened by history and different isms following up each other than art in the West? I do think that's a very good point, because indeed I do believe that on the one hand China's artists feel less burdened by conventions, traditions, schools, you could even say education. That doesn't have not only, of course, advantages, but you could face value say that the blossoming of contemporary Chinese art, in particular over the first 10, 15, 20 years, had a lot to do with the fact that these people didn't bother much about, you know, the canon, the rules, the tastes of curators, because there were no curators yet. There were almost no collectors yet. The downside of this is, of course, that after a while, when contemporary Chinese art boomed and prices skyrocketed, after, in particular, the Venice Biennial in 1999, when a large share of contemporary Chinese artists were, for the first time, on a very important public display in the Arsenale of the Venice Biennial, that this kind of success led to an enormous commercialization of contemporary Chinese art. So certainly today we have again a kind of change and maybe leveling of those trends, but the idealism, or you can also say the political criticism of the early years and this enormous commercialization in the second phase of the development of contemporary Chinese art are both still very present in the current affairs and within the current landscape and the current scene. There are artists going more one way and others who go more the other way. With more and more interest of Chinese local collectors and even the blossoming of the museum and gallery scene in China, there's of course more and more money available, which on the one hand may even propel the interest in making more money among artists, but at the same time allows also artists to be more financially independent and therefore again more daring and also radical in their expression. So I think generally speaking, the fact that Chinese art has become so successful shows that it is really a kind of extremely viable creative industry on the one hand, but it is also a tool for pushing the political boundaries, pushing knowledge, and connecting for a long time secluded society to the global world. Altogether, I would say you still feel there is a notion of politics, which is very interesting among the Chinese artists, which you probably haven't found for a long time in Europe or in the United States. Things have changed, as I mentioned already earlier, since there is more public critique on our Western values and Western society for many good reasons, and artists address this in their own way. So artists also in the Western world have become again more political. But that was something China had never lost. I think Chinese artists always felt in one or the other way also being political individuals who in their work in one or the other way address this. And so therefore, I do think that, yes, there was in the beginning maybe a larger naivety or also just an attempt to bypass traditions, conventions, but in many ways the Chinese catch up on this. You see many Chinese students studying in Western universities today. You see, as I mentioned earlier already, that Chinese artists reach out to their own traditions, like calligraphy, ink art, or landscape art, because they want to know, they want to learn, and they want to, at the same time, express themselves in their own way. So there was a question asked already before the session. I'm not even sure if Kai Kenneth Lee is among us here today, but we can probably quickly answer this question anyway. So the question was, were there gallery systems in China that documented modern art during the time between the last emperor of China and the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, or were modern art shown mainly in art academies and selected national museums? And during the time of the Cultural Revolution, if there were these gallery systems and museums documenting modern art, were some or more of them destroyed and substituted with propaganda art? It's a very complex question, which is not really related, as probably Kenneth Lee is also aware of, exclusively to China and not to contemporary Chinese art, because we are now speaking back to the times of the early 20th century and the 20th century of the Mao time. And I'm not feeling really entitled as an expert to speak about it, because that's not my expertise. However, let me just briefly answer in the following way. Generally speaking, it is worth to mention that art traditions had been imported from the West already in the late 19th century by Chinese artists who lived, for example, in Paris or in France, to study at that time also Impressionists and other current movements of art. So they started this. These artists started working in a similar way and brought also their traditions, their artworks and their new discoveries of art to China. So some new forms of art entered China in the early in the 20th century, even during the imperial times yet. More so in the short period of a kind of process of self definition and democratization in China before the first occupation by the Japanese. You have always to remember that that China was at war for a long time, and also first in the Civil War, then also at the same time being occupied by Japan, and therefore there was not really much space for developing art or even developing institutions of the art. So therefore, modern art rather disappeared soon after the turmoil started during the 20s. It got interrupted. And for a long time, China had not really public access to the, at that time, current movements of art. That did not change much after 1949, because then a new wave of Western influence arrived in China with communism, which was imposed by the Soviet Russians, as you know. So the reintroduction of art came now through the Soviet Union, and China taught the first generation of communist youth in after the 40s, in the 50s, with rather Soviet narratives of art, which was mostly socialist propaganda and realism. So there was actually no doubt that Mao China develop this further and create their own mold for it, but it is mostly influenced by the Soviet Union. And if you compare propaganda art of the Mao time with the art of during the Stalin time, you will easily see the similarities. So again, then there was a cultural revolution when all academia and museums were closed, and a lot of artworks were destroyed. And of course, therefore, there was no possibility of showing modern art. So all of this was actually not available for many decades. You can say between the 20s and 2000, for 70, 80 years, there was actually almost no access to international modern art. And all what you saw was either foreign art, or it was traditional art, or it was propaganda art. So now, hopefully, the last question is still there. As an exchange student at the CCAA in Hangzhou, I was privileged to experience the Chinese teaching methods, and I found it to be very old-fashioned and traditional. This is far cry from the experimental, groundbreaking works that have been produced and documented in, for example, the Sigg Collection. How do you explain this big discrepancy? Yeah, that's again a very good point. I think what is worth to mention is that there is a gap between the art institutions in China and the art scene in China. As I mentioned earlier, many of the creative people who even are based today in China, again, lived a major part of their life, often also their education, in the Western world, either in the US or in Europe. For example, we at the Zurich University of the Arts, when we are running, or when the university is running courses on art or music, a lot of Chinese students are around. They're studying sometimes for years in the West before often they go back. So in other words, I think a major part of the very powerful expressions of art you find in the Sigg Collection are not actually a result of the academia and the art education in China, but rather either self-education or influences from Western schools. I have to say, in particular, among the people who are my generation, 50, 60, between 50 and 60 today, like also Ai Weiwei or Fang Lijun or Wang Guanyi, most of these people had no whatsoever art education. Never. They never went through any kind of education. All what they learned, all what they created on their own. And most of them, rather by maybe picking up some stuff at these academies, for example, CAFA, Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. But then sooner or later they were able to travel. And I remember vividly how some of the artists explained to me this enormous experience they had when they were suddenly able to travel to Paris, to go to the Louvre or the Centre Pompidou, to go in Italy to churches to discover this enormous wealth and beauty of Western art with their own eyes, and to see that the prints, the books they had in China, often books from the Soviet Union with very, very bad quality, had actually nothing to do with the real thing they saw now with their own eyes. And then they started studying this, and of course studying also contemporary art of that time, visiting exhibitions like the Biennale or the Documenta, later participating there, getting in touch with international artists. And I think this kind of self-education was very important to many of these great artists. However, I see that some of the institutions try hard to improve education also in China itself, both by building up their own capacities of teachers and inviting international people. It will take some time for sure, but sooner or later also the institutions will be probably state of the art. All right, I think our time is up for today. If there's nothing else urgent to mention, I would like to thank all of you who attended this session today. As I mentioned in the beginning, there will be certainly possibilities for you to access our 6 chapters of the course itself, to interact also with our team on certain questions, to fill your journal, and to finish your course. We are actually moving on. There will be a new course coming up. I just want to mention in the end of this day. The title of this course will be slightly different, and not only the title, but also the content, of course. It's vocabularies of resilient art practice. So we are expanding a little bit out of the, say, territory of visual arts to all arts disciplines. What we have done is we have interviewed many art practitioners or cultural practitioners, cultural workers in different parts of the world, working in the field of publishing, filmmaking, visual arts, or performing arts, from different generations, being institutional or being non-institutional. And we collected all these different experiences, and you can really see that how globalization, how urbanization, digitalization have changed, have even challenged and disrupted existing professions in the art world, but at the same time created also new professions and new opportunities. So this course is going to be launched by end of the spring, and you're of course welcome to join us in this course as well. Have a nice Sunday, and maybe see you soon again.